Sangihung, as we say in Tewa, which is good evening to you. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to address on one of my favorite subjects, which happens to be native science, and to give some insights and some perspectives. Of course, Leroy is a hard act to follow in that context, but I'll try. Of course, you know, the work that I've done over these 40 plus years of being an educator, starting really in the sciences, particularly biological sciences, and then moving into science teaching and then into native studies. Itself is a journey of exploration of indigenous knowledge in a variety of different kinds of contexts and forms. And so a few years ago, I wrote a book called Native Science, which Leroy was gracious enough to write the foreword to as well. To sort of explore the cultural history of indigenous science and to, in a sense, create that foundation for exploration, not only in terms of the present, but into the future, in terms of the contributions that indigenous people can and will be making, I think, very profoundly making into the future, into the 21st century and beyond. You know, I've written several books that, in a sense, are circular in their thinking and dialogue and reflection about what is indigenous knowledge, what does that mean to indigenous people, and what are the kinds of foundations and perspectives and understandings that entails. So my presentation, getting right into it because of our time, is entitled Astronomy Through Native Eyes, Finding the Dynamic Center of Resonance with the Multiverse. And I'll go ahead and open this to get started on it. So, you know, I did a lot of thinking, actually developing this presentation while I was here attending the IPC meeting that Brian was conducting. And this presentation took many transformations during the dialogues and reflections that we had in those meetings. So I hope that it resonates with you, because resonance is really the key term in this whole perspective. The idea and the understanding that the focus of native science was really not to try to explain away the mystery of the natural world, but was really about finding ways to resonate with the natural world and the natural order towards, you know, the effect of sustainability and also of meaning of Indian life as a whole. So those are the thoughts that I want to sort of capitalize on as we move forward. I'm also a self-taught artist. I actually went to school, New Mexico Highlands University, you know, into the art program, and I was quickly very bored with Western art instruction at that time in that place because I had done most of that work already when I was in junior high and high school because we had an arts program, lucky enough, in our school that brought us in those places. And I was always interested in the natural world because of my own upbringing in my community. My grandmother was a herbalist, and so I knew and understood some very deep understandings of relationships and plants and the indigenous paradigm of thinking about the natural world. So, you know, as an artist, I also look at it in terms of that creative eye, that creative perspective. So a good friend of mine, Conrad House, you know, lets me use this particular image, and he calls it in the native eye, or through the native eye. And I really like it because it really conveys visually the whole message of indigenous thought, indigenous science, native science. Because as you see in that eye that's in the lower half, or lower part of that painting, the native eye looks out into a tapestry of relations, the flux that Leroy has mentioned. It's about interdependence, and it's about understanding the nature of interdependence and being able to find ways to resonate with that and interdependence in ways that allow for life, both human life and also the life of nature to continue. But getting back to some of the comments that Leroy has made, when you take a look at what is indigenous thought from the standpoint of let's say, philosophy, axiology means what do you value within the culture? What is the focus of your attention in the culture that drives essentially the way that you think and the way that you understand and the way that you relate to the natural world? And so for Native people, the value lies in the balance of relations, getting back to that tapestry of relationship of the native person to plants such as corn, the deer, the hummingbird, the antelope, the bear, the eagle, the forces of nature. All of those things make up that tapestry of relationship, and it's the relationship, a balanced relationship of all of those energies that, in a sense, makes life work. And so very early on, Indigenous people realized that they had to find ways to connect to that, to have resonance with that process, with that flux of the natural world. So epistemology is essentially how you come to know what you know. And so observing and doing and making and symbolizing and rhythm and ritual and ceremony, all with the context, within the context of a spiritual agency, was really the ways in which Native people came to know and understand their world and their relationships. In terms of logic, the logic really revolves around all elements and beings of the multiverse are linked together. Again, that interdependence, that interrelationship is refocused in this context of how the logic actually works. And finally, process, which Leroy also mentioned, is working with the understanding that all things are dependently interrelated in the harmony and the balance of the multiverse. Now, I'm really emphasizing multiverse in this because the grand unifying theory, idea, or concept, or push, within science, that there is one big answer, implies also that there is a universe, one verse. And so Indigenous thoughts looks at it in terms of multiverses, from the micro to the macro to the cosmic. And so understanding those perspectives of where Indigenous thought comes from and how it resides and how it operates, I think is very important. So native science is a product of really a different kind of creative journey. Because all of the knowledge of mankind is really the result of creative journeys, guided by philosophical thoughts that I've just sort of mentioned for Native people. And I use native science as a kind of metaphor for Native knowledge in all of its different manifestations, all of its different creations. And what it does essentially is it stories the world. And it includes, as I say here, creative ways for living and participating in relationship with the world through processes that I would call seeking life, relationship, and meaning. And so these are the kind of guiding thoughts, if you will, the first insights that, in a sense, characterize much of Indigenous thinking, manifests in songs, in dances, in ways of community, in art forms, on and on and on. So what's the creative context of this whole business of seeking life? Because if you actually take a look at Indigenous languages, many Indigenous languages have a term or word or metaphor that refers to this process, you see, of seeking life. In my language, it's woatsigi, for life's sake, we do this. And so that idea of seeking life is very much embedded, again, within the language, because the language reflects the epistemology of the people. So this natural creativity includes both an implicit and explicit order that is in constant flux and dynamic activity. Again, this is just rephrasing what Leroy has already said, with regard to that basic point. There is chaos in order. There is order in chaos. What we would call in biological sciences, there is a complex adaptive system, constantly, in a sense, evolving, developing, and really bringing order within disorder and back again. So there's that constant flux. And it's a fractal process, which means that it has its own logic as it emerges into the world. So all of those concepts and ideas are expressions of this dynamic principle that indigenous people have referred to, in their languages, in their stories, but metaphorically, not directly, but through metaphor. And so this idea of sense, perception, and creative participation. So from my perspective, an indigenous physicist not only observes the world, but participates in it with all of his or her sensual being. And so it's a very different kind of way of observing and knowing the world. If you participate in the experiment itself, you are a participant in it. So this idea of participation and affecting what you're looking at was very much a part of indigenous thinking. And therefore, becoming open to the natural world with all of one's senses, the body, mind, and spirit, is really the goal of native science. And so this idea of resonance, comes again as a very important term, because that's really what the goal of indigenous science is about. It's about this resonance, this ability to know how to resonate yourself with yourself and yourself, yourself and your community and the place in which you live and the natural world that you're a part of, and then ultimately with the cosmos. And so knowledge systems and ways of knowing and ways of perspective begin to congregate around those different levels of knowing and coming to know. And so as you look at indigenous cultures, indigenous traditions of native science, you begin to see that it is indeed, as I showed you that first picture, through the native eye, it is really interrelationship, interdependence, and knowing how to, in a sense, as Leroy said, surf the flux. The metaphoric mind is also very important to think about, because the metaphoric mind is actually the oldest mind. I call it the nature mind. It's the nature mind. And the metaphoric mind has been evolving in human beings for, maybe 3 million years or more. When Lucy first stood up and said, what's over on the other side of the mountain there? That long. And it's really, its greatest explosion of development really happened about 70,000 years ago in the Paleolithic era. And that when you all of a sudden began to see depictions of animals, depictions of plants, depictions of, this is in a sense could be said to be the creation of, or the beginning of human art, as we know it, as we begin to understand it today. So native science works, with the rational and metaphoric mind simultaneously. I know that's hard to kind of fathom, but it's having two minds and applying them both simultaneously as you need to do so. And so indigenous people develop those kinds of habits of mind. And really our ceremonies and our rituals are developed in such a way to develop exactly those processes, those ways of understanding the world and those abilities of the mind, because we do have the ability, as we know from brain research, to create and to understand and to have completely different thoughts simultaneously within our thinking. And so that was something that Native science worked with, Native people worked with. So its processes are tied to creativity, to perception, how you see something, to creation and understanding of how you image something, to physical sensing, how you feel it, and also to intuition, which is really that holistic, whole body thinking. So all of those aspects are part of the metaphoric mind. That's why you see that in indigenous languages, these kinds of understandings are related metaphorically. As I said, for life's sake we do this, is a metaphor. My first book, Look to the Mountain, is yet another metaphor, linguistic metaphor in Tewa, which is pronounced Pimpiobi, or look to the mountain, which means understand that when you're climbing this mountain or trying to understand something, that there's a path that you have come from, which is your history. There's a place that you are on top of the mountain, which is your present. And there's a perspective that you can see from those mountains, or from the top of the mountain, that is your future and the decisions that you have to make about where you're going to go next. And so there are thousands and thousands of these metaphors in native languages that epitomize the epistemology of the people themselves. So, as we look at this native mind, it reveals itself through abstract symbols. Native people are big on symbols, okay? We have a lot of symbols. Besides our metaphors in our languages, we have also key symbols that are packed with our understanding. There's visual spatial reasoning, sound in the form of music and listening, kinesthetic expression, various forms of creative, ecological, integrative, and spiritual thinking. All are being combined in this context of the native eye looking out into that tapestry of interrelationship. So this is why native science is expressed through stories, through art, through song, through dance, through ritual, through music, through community, through hunting and fishing, through farming, through healing, through architecture, and astronomies. And we could go on, but those are just a few. So, being an artist, I also studied, what is the relationship that Native people have to art. So, we didn't have a word for art, really. You're hard-pressed to find a word for art in most native languages, indigenous languages. But there's a word for the process of creative making. And that process is built around preparation, adherence to natural patterns, polychromatic time. In other words, everything has its own time, the right place and rightful intent, intrinsic well-practiced belief that you're doing and what you're doing, packing a symbol with meaning, a visual, a completion, a giveaway, and the appreciation of intrinsic meaning. So this is kind of the indigenous thinking around the process of art itself, but also, the creation of knowledge, the understanding of that knowledge. As mentioned before by Leroy, spiritual agency, perpetual dynamic, multidimensional harmony. All knowledge is related to creation, perpetuation of the natural world. The other intent is that through this process, we perpetuate not only human beings, but also perpetuate the natural world. Everything has a role. Everything has spirit. All is related. Mutual reciprocity, history, listening, dialogue, appropriate technology, context, dreams, patterns, cycles, elders, ritual knowledge, initiation, story, observing, and renewing life. So I have been given the 5-minute hand, so I'm going to go through this real quick. Look at these images. This is the history of indigenous people and I could have chosen, relationship to plants, relationship to animals, relationship to places, architecture. I could have chosen traditional art forms, So it's a system, and so it doesn't really matter where you come in terms of the doorway. You end up basically in the same space and the same perspectives. So this is astronomy. Baja site in Mexico, about 10,000 years ago. Native people were counting and measuring the moon and the sun, summer solstice and winter solstice numbers of days. Here, right here, in this territory, the medicine wheel tradition began about 10,000 years ago. The development of a systematic way of, in a sense, understanding, trying to understand the meaning and having resonance with the movement of the sun, the moon, and particular stars, ritual, song, dance, art associated with all of that, community building. As you can see, the medicine wheel sites congregated primarily in Alberta, a few as far south as northern Colorado. But it was a tradition 10,000 years ago that was vibrant and alive and applying those principles of native science that I've just described. The mound builders, Cahokia, Natchez, the Sun Priest, that whole complex, again, a whole nother system of native astronomy, again, practiced around those precepts of native science. Some of the descendants of the mound builders are the Skeety Pawnee, who call themselves the Star People. And there's a Skeety Pawnee star priest wearing a star buffalo robe. Creating the places in which you live as the model of your cosmos, your understanding of your cosmos, which is common for all native tribes. The structure itself symbolizes your worldview. The idea of stargazing and observing and thinking and reflecting, as this Skeety Pawnee village site shows. The model of the cosmos internalized into the Skeety Pawnee earth mound. The directions and the notion of directions and the importance of directions, which I won't get into, but directions are very important because how you orient yourself to the world has all to do with how you resonate with it. And so proper orientation, focus on sacred directions, in this case the semi-cardinal directions, associating a plant or a tree in this case, an animal, and a natural process like lightning and yellow, a color, just as one example. So indigenous people looked at both semi-cardinal directions as well as the cardinal directions to use as a way to, in a sense, order their life on earth. Recording the times and of those phases that we move through time, is the basis of the winter count, also the telling of the history of the people. The people who told that history, who kept that history, who counted the days between the solstices, were also given authority of power and represented by these star canes. One Tahana Odom, the other is a Creek chief. The naming of constellations, which then create storylines around how those constellations came into being. In Chaco Canyon, we have Fajada Butte, on which the sun dagger stones lie, which created a mechanism without any moving parts whatsoever, just sun and just the sunlight and shadow, to mark the center of time for noontime at summer solstice, and also not only that, but also to understand how how this process of resonance could be essentially manipulated, but not, I wouldn't say manipulated, but rather built upon for creating this kind of technology. And of course, it didn't mark only just summer solstice at noon. It marked also the winter solstice. It also marked the 18-and-a-half-year cycle of the moon, and on and on and on. So I just want to finish with these few slides, to give you a sense that indigenous science indigenous knowledge is very complex. It is multidimensional and multi-contextual. And in many ways, I think that as we begin to explore where are the places where we can bridge Western science, with native knowledge, that we have to really begin to look at our history first. Again, using the metaphor of look to the mountain, look at the path that we have been on before, because that's our history. Understand our present, in terms of our present realities, our present understandings of ourselves and the world, but also look at it in terms of, where are the possibilities of the future. And that's where the creative spirit kicks in again. That idea of resonance, that idea of perspective, that idea of participation with the world. So, these are just some sites in Chaco Canyon in which this technology, these ideas, these perspectives were represented. This is the cultural histories of our systems of science. That I call science. Every tribe had this, and of course I'm highlighting certain tribes, but every tribe had forms of astronomy, understood many of these cycles. And so as we begin to sort of look into the future, particularly in the future of indigenous education, this is part of the legacy that we have to recapture, the history that we have to relearn, and the understandings, about resonance that are very important in our time, in our place. Because in this time and place, because of the nature of the human impact on the natural world, we must find some new ideas, new perspectives, new understandings of how to interact and interrelate with the world that really indigenous people have always had, but we have to bring them to the forefront and also bring them into a contemporary expression. And so, I'll leave you with those thoughts, those perspectives. We have hundreds of star stories that metaphorically relate these ideas about relationship, about interdependence, about resonance, with the natural world. And so I think that, our work is great, but I think we have to begin to allow ourselves the space, develop the space to do that. And so, guess where the medicine wheels ended up? This is a peg cross. It's also a medicine wheel in the Valley of Mexico. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts and perspectives. I hope I've given you some insights. There's a lot more to this, but let's leave it at that. Thank you.